Would you like to see me super kick Spider-Man?
Hey.
Alright, now that I have your attention, my name is Skylar Mars, and welcome to Squared Circle Story. Hello, wrestling fans of the world. I am your host, Skylar Mars, and welcome to Squared Circle Story, a show where we talk about the history of everything in wrestling, from the belts to the people to the moves, etc. Now, since the first episode, I figure we should start from the beginning. We're going to talk about the origins of the entire sport of professional wrestling. Now, professional wrestling is one of the oldest sports in the entire world. In fact, it may even be the oldest. Many scientists and historians argue that running may be the oldest sport. However, I very much doubt that, cavemen settled anything by a foot race. Wrestling did not get its name as a sport until a little later in ancient Greece. Yes, I'm talking about the Olympics, Olympic wrestling, basically the sport where it's just a little ring, two guys in unitards, where they try and pin one another to the mat. Not that different from, modern wrestling, now I think about it. And yes, I know this isn't pro wrestling, this is the amateur wrestling or real wrestling, but we'll get to pro wrestling, don't worry, we'll get there. In the 1870s, many European martial artists started taking the different grapple-based martial arts, such as judo and amateur wrestling, and combining them into the mother of modern WWE-style pro wrestling into a sport which at the time and even to this day is known as catch wrestling. In fact, most European nations still refer to modern pro wrestling as catch. Here's your example. Aye, mate, you want to get your fish and chips and go see the catch? Oh yeah, love to see Randy Orton in a catch match. Okay, that was a little bit racist, I apologize. By the early 20th century, catch wrestling had become one of the most popular sports in the world. It was covered in the newspaper, it was covered on the radio. Everybody wanted to see catch wrestling, and there were two titans who everyone wanted to see come battle it out. It was the biggest dream match in the world, and obviously, it was for the World Heavyweight title. Keep in mind, this is still when wrestling was unscripted. This was real wrestling. The rules were simple. Either submit your opponent or pin them to the mat for the 1, 2, 3, which are the basis for the modern rules of professional wrestling in the first place. Now, the two titans I spoke about earlier, it was the American Submission Machine versus the Russian Lion. Their names were Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt. When the match finally went down, George Hackenschmidt became victim to Frank Gotch's signature toe hold, and while locked in the hold, he turned to Frank Gotch and told him, "Mr. Gotch, I surrender my title to you." Gotch had done the impossible. He had submitted the Russian Lion and became the World Heavyweight Champion, and his career would even end undefeated. He would never lose the belt. He retired and the belt was vacated. However, history being different might not have gone that way. See, there was a rematch, and it's a lot like how everyone is waiting for Pacquiao to fight Mayweather again, but, this was the match that killed catch wrestling. Once the rematch for the title was announced, Frank Gotch came up with a devious, almost heel-style plan. Again, keep in mind, this wrestling was still real. This is real life we're talking about. And he hired a man who was an expert submission specialist at that time. Don't laugh, don't be immature. Wrestlers who specialized in submission were called hookers. Yeah, I know. Hookers, blah, blah, blah. He hired a hooker. I get it. Anyways, Frank Gotch hired the hooker to wrestle against Hackenschmidt in a sparring match, basically a little bit of training. However, he hired him to injure him during that sparring match, breaking his ankle. Gotch still went to fight Hackenschmidt anyways, and Hackenschmidt submitted to the toe hold yet again. But it was obvious he was hurt, and it was obvious that Gotch made it happen. So when the news got out, wrestling lost all legitimacy and died as a sport. Frank Gotch killed catch wrestling. And where there is darkness comes golden light in the form of 3 men. They called themselves the Gold Dust Trio. See, after the death of catch wrestling as a sport, it was more or less adopted by the circus and circus performers. Basically, they would have the strongest man they could find go out and fight any person from the crowd in a wrestling match, just to put on a show and show, we have the most dominant fighter ever. This is where the creation of characters and backgrounds and fake things of that nature. They would even have women fight men, and it was impressive at the time. kind of the inspiration for such ideas as the Fabulous Moolah or China. The last great catch world heavyweight champion was known as Ed the Strangler Lewis. Yes, the Strangler. He wrestled in France one night, and when he applied a chokehold, the French audience assumed he was strangling his opponent, hence where he got the nickname. And he was one of 3 men who would save the sport of catch by turning it into theater, by turning it into pro wrestling. It was him, Billy Sandow, and Toots Mondt. They would become the Gold Dust Trio, effectively starting the first ever wrestling federation and the business model for all current pro wrestling. They're the ones who made wrestling fake, but they're also the ones who saved it. And in the footsteps of the Gold Dust Trio, no, not Gold Dust, I meant, Ed, Toots, and Billy. Anyways, in the footsteps of the Gold Dust Trio, we would see guys like Vince McMahon Sr. start wrestling federations. The territories came up, Vince McMahon tore them down, and the WWF, or Worldwide Wrestling Federation, was born. And a story for another time, so I'll make this part short. It later became, World Wrestling Entertainment under Vince McMahon. Now there are many other fascinating and important parts of wrestling history there to learn, but I'll cover them in future episodes. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Skylar Mars, and this has been Squared Circle Story.